Hey, welcome to the Sunday discussion. So today our talk is going to be about epistemology. I don't know how many people watch the videos. I noticed as I was watching them that a lot of these videos were pretty dense philosophy, so I'm going to try to keep it pretty light, and this might not go on as long as some of our other discussions just because it gets so complicated so quickly, and it kind of turns into a bit of a mind chase where you're sort of thinking about thoughts and it becomes very circular. So I don't want to get to that too much. If we do end up straying off topic, I think that's totally fine for that reason. But I'm going to start pretty simply for now. So epistemology is a very old subject. This goes back to Socrates and Aristotle. I'll start with a quote from Aristotle from a great video that I pulled up about this. Academy of Ideas went into epistemology, and I love Academy of Ideas. And he starts with the quote, "All men by nature desire to know." And that's Aristotle from Metaphysics. And he's right. We all have this desire in us to know. And this is basically why we're here. Epistemology comes from episteme, which is the Greek word for knowledge, and then ology is a doctrine or study of. So the word translates into the study of knowledge, but what it more commonly is referred to is the theory of knowledge. So Socrates in the Theaetetus, which is a book that Plato wrote, is asked if knowledge is the same thing as true judgment. And he gives an example, a little story of a lawyer who has to defend his client accused of a violent crime. Now, the client is innocent, but there are no witnesses and there is no evidence. So the lawyer knows that his best strategy is not to teach the jury to use their reasoning to come to this conclusion. His goal is to get the jury to be charmed into liking him, and then they will believe that his defendant is innocent. And this will be a correct belief. They will be right that the guy's innocent, but the question becomes, does the jury know that the client is innocent? And our intuition tells us no. Even if what they believe is true, they didn't get to that conclusion in the right way by reasoning through it or having any facts or evidence. So the only reason they believe he's innocent is because they like his lawyer so much. So it doesn't feel like knowledge in that way. And I mean, this was 2,000 years ago that Socrates was giving this very poignant example, and since then we have been wondering, what is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? What is the difference between knowledge and belief? And this is a lot of what epistemology basically addresses. And we're going to mostly address that here as much as we can. Basically, we're going to ask, what questions does epistemology address in terms of this? What does it mean to know versus belief? And why did this field arise in the first place? Why does epistemology even matter? I was talking about this with Shao last night, and he was trying to tell me it doesn't matter, but we're going to see if it does or not. So, some of the questions that epistemology brings up is, what is the nature of knowledge? What prevents us from attaining knowledge? What is it that we can even possibly know? And how does knowledge differ from opinion, prejudice, or belief? So we'll start with, how is knowledge obtained? Because this kind of goes into what is knowledge. There's really two basic ways of doing it. The first is through our senses and our experience. This is called empiricism, which is kind of like scientific. Basically means if I observe this plant and I look at its characteristics, it's this color, it's got these features, it smells like this. This is direct sense experience knowledge. The problem then becomes, can we trust our senses? Sometimes information given by our senses is misleading. Sometimes it's an illusion, such as a mirage. Sometimes you're hallucinating. Our senses are very limited. In a way, our senses influence how we view reality. The way that the world looks to a bat, for instance, is very different from the way that it looks to us. So our senses actually shape the experience that we're having into a different one from the reality that many other creatures might have. So what the ancient Greeks started to think about was there must be another way that knowledge can be obtained that overcomes our illusory sensory experience, which can't always be relied upon. And their answer for this was reason and rationalism. So there's basically two different types of knowledge, propositional knowledge and practical knowledge. Propositional knowledge is mostly what epistemology is about, and that is knowledge of facts, such as I know that a zebra has 4 legs, I know that 2 + 2 = 4. Practical knowledge, by contrast, is knowledge of how to drive a car, how to swim, how to walk. Practical knowledge is just the ability to know how to do something. It's often implicit or unconscious. We utilize practical knowledge every waking second of our lives, essentially. We don't have to analyze and educate ourselves and gain knowledge to walk down a flight of stairs every time we come to the next step. We developed that knowledge at a very early age, and we can use that practical knowledge to walk downstairs unconsciously. And we retain that practical knowledge for the rest of our lives. Practical knowledge is not really a concern for epistemology. Mostly it doesn't come up. One person that did look into it was Martin Heidegger. Heidegger was a philosopher in the early 1900s. He was kind of a Nazi. He's not a great guy, but he did have a lot of interesting ideas. And one thing he did was he thought that practical knowledge was fundamental and even more important than propositional knowledge. He thought that propositional knowledge is essentially useless if you don't have practical knowledge, because if you're thinking about all these different facts but you don't know how to get out of bed in the morning, none of it matters. It's kind of ironic, though, because even when he was working on practical knowledge, what he was trying to do was discover facts about practical knowledge. So in a way, he was using propositional knowledge, which is fact-based knowledge, to try to understand practical knowledge. So we're basically going to talk about propositional, though. We're not really going to talk about practical, unless, of course, you guys wanted to, because we have plenty of time. But most of epistemology goes into knowledge of facts. So what does it mean to know a fact? So I have a quote here from a philosopher named Nicholas, I think it's Rescher. He says, "But what is propositional knowledge? It is emphatically not an activity or a performance. You cannot answer the question, 'What are you doing?' with the response, 'I am knowing that Paris is the capital of France,' any more than you could say, 'I am owning this watch,' or 'I am liking roses.' Knowing a fact is not something that someone does. It is a condition that one has come to occupy in relation to information." So a lot of philosophers think of knowledge in terms of justified true belief. This is a very common phrase in epistemology. Now, why is it all of these things? It has to be a belief because for it to be knowledge, you are believing that it's true. It has to actually be true in the real world, not just because you believe it. And it has to be justified, which means you have to have good reasons for believing it. Now, not all justified true belief is actually knowledge. There's kind of something missing because when this theory first came up, a lot of philosophers said, well, hang on, there is such thing as justified true belief that's not knowledge. For instance, let's say that you are wearing a watch that says it's noon right now, and you're in a room with a clock, and the clock also says it's noon. So you believe that it's 12 o'clock right now. And it just so happens that you're right, it is 12, but the problem is that both of these clocks are broken. So you're using a flawed reasoning to get to this knowledge. You are justified in believing that because both of the clocks say that, and you happen to be right, but it's still more of an accident, and our intuition tells us it's not really knowledge. Another example would be if you went to a zoo and someone had taken a bunch of donkeys and painted them like zebras, but there happened to be one real zebra in the mix, and you just so happen to be looking at the real one, and then you believe you're looking at a real zebra because that's what it looks like. But you just happen to be right, and if you were looking at any other one of the fake zebras, you would be wrong. And the only reason you think it's a real one is because it looks like one. And so this goes into why our senses can be so wrong. Okay, so another good example of this is what it means to be justified. Let's say that you have two people who tell you two different things. One says, I know it's raining outside, and the other one says, I believe it's raining outside. Intuition tells us that this is different, that these two claims are not the same. And the reason they aren't the same is because we know that in order to know it's raining outside, you would have a good reason for that. You're either standing in the rain, or you just walked through the rain, or you're looking at it from a window. Whereas if someone said, I believe it's raining outside, you're missing that justification. They could be wrong about it. They're probably not looking at it. If they were standing in it, it wouldn't be a belief. They would be saying, I know it's raining outside. We do not use these terms in the same way in our daily lives. There must be solid grounds for knowledge, and this is why opinions and guesses are not considered knowledge. Real quick, let's go into why this is even important. Why do we need a theory of knowledge? Humans are inquisitive by nature. This goes back into the Aristotle quote. We, by nature, desire to know things. This is a quote as well by Nicholas Rescher. Knowledge brings us great benefits. The release of ignorance is foremost among them. We have evolved within nature into the ecological niche of an intelligent being. In consequence, the need for understanding, for knowing one's way about, is one of the most fundamental demands of the human condition. So, this is a great quote, but it doesn't really address why we need a theory of knowledge. It just says why we need knowledge, why knowledge itself is important compared to belief. But why do we need a theory of knowledge? Why do we need epistemology? If we accept what is presented to our senses, and we are not skeptical of the validity of what we are seeing and experiencing, then there is no need for a theory of knowledge, because you are correlating what you see with what you know. However, the minute that you do start to question what you think you know, what you think you experience, what you think your senses are telling you, that's when epistemology happens. Is it dogmatic to assume that we can know reality objectively? Do we take for granted whether or not we can know the nature of the universe? Do the ideas in our mind correspond to the world outside us? This is the question. This is what epistemology is trying to grasp. And as soon as that answer becomes maybe not, we have to wonder, then what is really knowledge? Um, this is a quote from the Academy of Ideas video. When one begins to question if we can be sure that the ideas or representations in our mind actually correspond to the world outside of ourselves, or if we can ever hope to bridge the gap between our ideas about the world and the world itself, then the problem of knowledge arises, and with it the need for epistemology. I think this is actually a fundamental aspect of Buddhism. As soon as I read this part, that's what brought to mind with me. And Mike, I don't know if you're going to agree with this or not, but this is why I think it's so important to still the mind and experience the world not through thought. Because the question is, our ideas about the world might not be how the world actually is. And how do we know whether or not that's the case? We have to be able to look at the world not through these ideas, not through our thoughts, but just through our senses. Whether or not those senses are distorted or limited, these are the instruments we have by which to perceive the world.
Yeah, I agree that um, the thought process, emotions, and ideas, they get in the way to seeing reality, uh, but also in a strange way, reality gets in its way because you're dependent on your senses, and they're not actually showing you what is actually going on. Sort of like a satellite that beams a signal to your TV. That signal is sort of like what reality is, and your TV is sort of like your senses. And so you don't actually see the image or sound flying through the air. It's a different signal. And so uh, you are left with just your senses, and that's all you can that's all you have to know uh, what we call reality. But yeah, taking a step back from thoughts and feelings and emotions can help you see that a bit clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is the empiricist approach to it. Um, And that's why I think the bat analogy is so good, because the reality to a bat is the same reality signal that's coming to us, but the senses interpret it in such different ways. Um, and this is why the ancient Greeks thought the power of reason was so important, because, for instance, we can see a mirage of water in the distance on a hot day, and without our reason, we might perceive water there. But our reason tells us, no, this is just a mirage. And that's what knowledge is, the knowledge that it's a mirage and not water. Um, so there's a couple really classic examples in history of skepticism of the world around us and what we can know, including our senses. Probably the most famous is Descartes. René Descartes was a French philosopher, 1596 to 1650. So he addressed this pretty early on in a book called Meditations on First Philosophy in 1641, is when it was published. And his thought experiment was about a demon. The video I shared keeps calling it an evil genius, but it's basically a demon because René Descartes was very religious. And he believed, well, he was asking the question, is there anything that you can know for sure? Uh, what if the world around us was just an illusion that a demon created in order to trick us, and it's not really there. This is kind of the same thing as the Matrix problem. The modern day version is, what if we are trapped in the Matrix and everything around us is just a computer simulation? And he said, well then, these people around me might not be real, this place, my body might not be real. What is it that I can know for sure about my own existence? Rene Descartes said, well, I'm a thinking being. Surely an evil genius couldn't possibly deceive me beyond that. For a demon or an evil genius to deceive me about anything, I have to exist in the first place. Therefore, because I'm thinking, I exist. And this is the great I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. As long as you're thinking about anything, you know that you exist as a thinking being. But, so what? Whether or not a demon is deceiving us, there's a huge diversity of ideas that exist. They may not be real, but they represent greater and lesser things. And the best of all these ideas, to Rene Descartes, was the idea of God, an infinite, perfect being. And he said, this idea is so amazing that it couldn't possibly have come from an imperfect, finite being. I couldn't have made this idea up. Therefore, having an infinite idea that cannot be produced by a finite being must come from an infinite being. And therefore, God exists. And if God exists, he wouldn't let us be trapped by a demon. And it's not the strongest argument to counteract the skepticism, but, you know, it was the 1500s, or 1600s, I guess. So that's a pretty famous concept. Another famous example of this is much older. I believe it's the 7th century or so. It's a Zhuangzi. I think I said that right, probably not. And I believe he was a Buddhist monk who said, once upon a time I dreamed I was a butterfly, fluttering around, to all intents and purposes, a butterfly. I was only conscious of my happiness as a butterfly, unaware that I was Zhuangzi. As soon as I awakened, and there I was, veritably myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. Between the man and butterfly, there is necessarily a distinction. The transition is called the transformation of material things.
That was really beautiful. I hadn't heard that before.
Oh yeah, isn't that a lovely story? I believe he was Buddhist. He might not have been. This is an old story. I should have looked up his origins. But Descartes kind of addresses this. Descartes says, even if you are dreaming, you should still be able to know that a square has 4 sides, or that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But how do we know? Just because it feels natural that a square has to have 4 sides doesn't mean that it is. The demon could be tricking us even into that, where the reality in the step above the dream, where the demon lives, 2 plus 2 equals 5. And we've just been tricked into thinking even those intuitions aren't real. So let's see here. This is skepticism, essentially. This is absolute skepticism, skepticism of whether or not the outside world exists. A lot of philosophy starts here, especially with the bigger philosophers. They kind of start with, well, how do I know anything at all exists? And once you build from there, you start to build your other more specific philosophies. Wittgenstein does this very famously, Bertrand Russell did, obviously Descartes, a couple others. And basically there's 2 approaches to skepticism, which started with the ancient Greeks. One is called academic skepticism. And academic skepticism basically says complete knowledge is impossible. Sensory perceptions aren't enough to know. You might be dreaming or in the simulation of the matrix. Your impressions can be misleading. You are under the impression that you're talking to Lauren right now, that you're listening to her voice, but I could be Lauren's evil twin, or I could be some kind of imposter who's just faking the voice very well. So even our impressions can be doubted. So academic skepticism says knowledge is impossible. Basically, everything that we perceive as knowledge is just justified belief that might or might not be true. The other approach of skepticism is Pyrrhonian skepticism. Pyrrhonian skepticism says doubt everything, even whether or not knowledge is possible. So doubt even the doubting itself, basically. No conclusions. Keep all questions open. This kind of goes into more Eastern philosophy as well. Even if this is a dream or the Matrix and we don't know anything about it, we still do have to function in this reality. And this is kind of one of my favorite answers to skepticism that I came across. And let me see if I can find the guy who talks about it. So there's a couple different answers to skepticism in these videos. One is by Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was a great philosopher. I really need to get into him. His answer is called the Russellian way. Bertrand Russell lived 1872 to 1970, so he was operating around the early 1900s. And he said that yes, it's possible that we are deceived and life is a dream or we live in the Matrix. Enoch has a question. What positive benefit does such a philosophical, skeptical thinking do to benefit a human? Oh, yes. I sort of went into this when I went into why do we study this, which is basically if you don't question the world around you and whether or not it's real, you don't need epistemology. You are accepting your senses and your concepts of knowledge. But why it might be useful is because the things that you're perceiving that you think you know might not be real. And one of the best examples of why that is important would be in a courtroom. Let's say you're on a jury and you think that you know what is going on. If you're not open to being wrong about that, and if you're not reanalyzing your initial preconceptions, beliefs, biases, or judgments, you might end up believing something that isn't true, and that can have real-world ethical consequences in the context of a jury. But you know, it has practical applications in all of our lives. Yeah, and I'll go into that more later. This is what's called Virtue Epistemology, which is kind of an answer to skepticism as well, but it takes the whole approach a little differently. I'll go into that a little bit later. But yeah, so Bertrand Russell. So Bertrand Russell says, okay, yeah, we might live in the Matrix, and or this might be a dream, or there might be a demon deceiving us, but we don't have a good reason to believe that that's the case, and we have two good reasons to accept that it's not the case. Our experience comes from reality, real sensations corresponding with real objects. The skeptical hypothesis that everything is fake is too convoluted. It requires some kind of external world that you have been trapped in the matrix or in some demon's spell. It requires a lot of different complicated things going on, such as what is that world like? Why are you trapped here? What is the configuration of your trap? things just become very complicated very fast, and the common sense hypothesis, which is that the world around us is real, is simple. It's systematic. It explains what our senses are telling us in a simple, direct way. It's the intuitive, common sense understanding that we have about the world, and we shouldn't reject it unless there's something inconsistent about our instincts. Common sense is our instinctive starting point, and skepticism rejects our instincts. And Bertrand Russell basically says we shouldn't reject our instincts unless we have a good reason to. Bertrand Russell was very scientific. He said, "Belief in the outer world forms a consistent scientific theory about how dreams are caused, how perception works, how our senses work." He says, "The skeptical argument that none of this is real is powerful enough for us to maintain a very slight doubt about our common sense beliefs and our perception of the world, and that it's good to have that slight doubt. It's good to be 1 or 2% unsure about what you're perceiving, what you think you know, what is going on around you. But also, reasonable judgment of the world is strong enough that even with that doubt, our reasonable judgment should still count as knowledge. Science still works even with that slight doubt. And that should be our approach, common sense." So that's one answer. Another way is the Morean way, which was developed by G.E. Moore. He was a philosopher from 1873 to 1958, so about the same time as Bertrand Russell. And he was answering Descartes' problem as well, and saying, you don't need God to explain away skepticism. You don't need to infer from the best or simplest explanation either. If you need proof, just look at your hands or any object. And a lot of philosophers start this way. Wittgenstein famously starts this way by looking at his hands. He says, here's one hand, here's another. Hands are external objects, therefore external objects are real. If a skeptic tells you that your hand might not be there, you don't have to prove that they are. He has to prove that they're not. The fact that you can't prove that your hands are actually here doesn't mean that they're not, and doesn't mean that you need to. This is the most basic fact possible, is the sensory perception of your hands as external objects. And there is nothing more basic of a fact than that. There's another answer which is more semantic, and this is Hilary Putnam. He basically says that the skeptic has to use meaningful words such as demon or matrix, or in this video the common example is a brain in a vat, and that if you didn't understand what a brain was or what a vat was, you wouldn't even be able to understand the skeptic's argument. Therefore, a brain has to exist. Even if you're stuck in a matrix, the concept of a real brain has to exist for you to possibly be a brain in a vat. Therefore, brains are real, even if they're not real around you right now. That's basically the semantic argument. So I'm trying to find my favorite one. Okay, here's another one, still not my favorite, which is the defensive approach. And this wonders why skepticism was appealing to us in the first place. Timothy Williamson basically said skepticism is good and helpful, but in the concept of questioning our entire existence, it's taken too far. Critical thought and skepticism is kind of like our cognitive immunity system. It's good to question things. It keeps us healthy. It keeps our minds healthy. It prevents us from having bad ideas. So it's a good immunity system to have, but when it starts to attack everything, it becomes more like an autoimmune disease, and it becomes bad. If you question everything, you can't question anything well. Skepticism basically tells us that we can't know something unless we know everything possible. The standards that it demands are too high. It basically says if you don't know for a fact that you're in the matrix, you can't know anything. But you'd have to pretty much be omniscient to the level of God to have that kind of knowledge. And that he says that standard for knowledge is too high. And we should be able to have a concept of knowledge that is incomplete and open to being wrong, but still considered knowledge. So we come across the Gettier problem. I think I'm going to skip the Gettier problem because it's very complicated. It basically goes into a formula. Subject S knows proposition P if and only if three conditions hold true. And the proposition would be the fact. So we only have knowledge if the fact is actually true, we believe that it's true, and we're justified in believing it's true. Justified true belief. The Gettier problem is that he basically started saying, well, what about the broken clock scenario? What about the zebra scenario? What about all these situations where you're justified in thinking it, you happen to be right, and you believe you're right, but it's still not knowledge. Because you don't realize, for instance, that you're in a fake zoo, or you don't realize, for instance, that the clocks are broken. And so part of your faulty knowledge is that you believe these clocks are telling you the accurate time because they're working, and they're not. This gets really complicated. I started to realize as I was going through these videos that this is probably too complicated of philosophy. Philosophy at a certain point almost becomes like math. They basically say, if S then P. If P then JTB. If JTB then not knowledge because of K. And it turns into math and logic very quickly. It's very fascinating, and we could go into it further if you guys really want to, but I'm going to skip ahead a bit, I think. So the answer that I like most about skepticism is that it doesn't really matter whether or not we're in the matrix, because this is no different from how our reality could be constructed anyway. And I wish I could find the guy that talks about it. He basically says, well, we've got string theory, and we've got particle theory, and we've got this matrix theory. And basically what they're all telling us is that the world is either made up of particles or atoms, vibrating strings, or code, or pixels. And it doesn't really matter to us what the world is made up of. It doesn't matter that we're in a matrix, because if I'm sitting here at a desk and I say, it is true that I'm sitting at a desk, and I know that I'm sitting at a desk, it doesn't matter if the desk is made up of code or made up of vibrating strings. That doesn't change the truth of my statement or the knowledge of that fact in my head.
Yeah, I agree, and that's kind of where I had gotten to pretty quickly after watching some of the videos. I was like, I'm gonna be very boring this Sunday because I'm not gonna have that much to say, because that's just, what you just said was pretty much all I could say about it.
Yeah. And this is the answer to the overall skepticism, which basically says, how do we know that the world is real? And it's a pretty intuitive answer. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I'm in a dream right now or if I'm in reality, because whether or not each one is true, I'm still here. And the world can be made up of a dream or vibrating strings or code, and it doesn't change the fact that this is a table in front of me. Now, that answers our fundamental problem of what is reality and is it real, but it doesn't stop the process of epistemology, because then we can still wonder about knowledge within this world. That basically gives us a concrete place to start from, that our senses are corresponding with a real world, but we still have the problem of our knowledge being flawed, our senses being distorted, and our assumptions and beliefs being open to being wrong. And this is where we get into virtue epistemology, which was one of my favorite ideas to come across. So with virtue epistemology, we've got, let's see, a good analogy for it is ethics. Ethics is to moral behavior as virtue epistemology is to intellectual thought. So basically, we want to ask, how should we think, in the way that ethics asks, what should we do? And this is where it becomes practical and applicable to our lives, where we can say, is curiosity good? What makes someone wise? How do you balance conflicting testimony in an investigation? These are intellectual virtues and vices. There was an example in one of these videos. Let's say you have a detective and they have an abundance of evidence that this person is guilty, and they have a room full of witnesses that saw that person do it, but one witness is lying. Would you throw the case out because one witness is lying? Would it be ethical, intellectually, to let that person go because of that one liar? What is the right thing to do in terms of knowledge? So typically, with epistemology, it's what's called a normative discipline. It's descriptive. It's describing how things are. And virtue epistemology is about how things ought to be. Epistemology is to our intellectual lives, what ethics is to our practical lives. We have intellectual virtues and vices in this theory of virtue epistemology. We don't want to ask what are the features that are common to all instances of knowledge, but rather we want to ask, what constitutes intellectual virtue? What does it mean to be intellectually virtuous? This is a very straightforward answer to a lot of the complicated Gettier problem stuff. So one of the problems of virtue knowledge is that you could be virtuous and still be wrong. You could go about the process of gaining information and gaining knowledge. You could be that detective and you do your job perfectly well and you do everything right. You gather what you think is evidence and you gather a room full of witnesses and you practice intellectual virtue, but still it ends up that all the witnesses are lying, all the evidence was pointing to someone else, and then you're wrong. So this is one of the problems of virtue epistemology. But virtue epistemology would also say that you have to be open to being wrong, even in that context, because what matters, if someone's life is on the line, and that depends upon your information gathering and your decision about what you know and what happened, then you have an ethical obligation to know what the truth is as much as you can. Virtue epistemology in this way can connect the study of epistemology to politics, law, religion, even spirituality, arts, and education. It becomes very practical and can bring the study of knowledge and what is virtuous knowledge into a central aspect of our lives. this isn't a question we often ask ourselves until we come across something where there are consequences, like in a jury situation. But as I said earlier, we have consequences in our daily lives. Um, it's heightened by a jury situation, but it happens every time we interact with people in a way. When we assume that we know something about someone else and act in that way, you could say we're not being virtuous because of that knowledge if that person has changed and we don't see that because we're relying on our past knowledge of them. Because a courtroom is one of the best examples, in one of these videos, they use the example of To Kill a Mockingbird. Has anybody seen or read that? That's okay. So in To Kill a Mockingbird, a black man is basically accused of raping a white woman, and he goes to court, and it's an all-white jury, and they have a witness. They have like a testimony of a witness, but the witness is also black, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So the white jury just can't believe that a black man would tell the truth, and so they dismiss the testimony. And this would be an example of an intellectual vice. This is a lack of virtue ethics in epistemology, because they believe that what they know is that a black man can't tell the truth. He must be lying. And that flawed understanding of knowledge is what rejects their testimony and rejects them from seeing the actual truth. And the ethical consequences of it are why we use the word virtue, because we talk about what is good and what is bad. What is it to be a good thinker? Essentially, that is intellectual virtue, and an intellectual vice would be a racial prejudice. I had a feeling that this stuff would be pretty dense because it's not something that we can really sink our teeth in until we start to apply it practically to our lives. It's fun for philosophers who are 20 years old smoking weed saying, man, I wonder if we live really in the Matrix. Like, that's kind of an interesting place to start, but once you solve that problem easily, it doesn't really matter. You kind of wonder what the point of all of this is, and that's why I think I like virtue ethics so much, because it does make it important again, by rephrasing the question, not what is knowledge, but what is the right way to go about understanding knowledge, using knowledge, questioning it. What is the good and ethical and virtuous way to do this? So contextualism is another answer to skepticism, that kind of aligns with what I was talking about before. Contextualism is basically the idea that nothing can be known permanently, and this goes into Buddhism as well with impermanence. If I say, I know that it's sunny right now, it's not going to be sunny later. In 12 hours, I can say, I know that it's not sunny now. And both of these statements are true, but they're only true in the context of the time that I say them. So contextualism says knowledge can't be universal. It has to be contextual. A fact is true in one context and not in another. It becomes more about language than actual knowledge. It becomes a lot about the word now, for instance. It's true here and not there. I think this is a good answer, but it makes us wonder, is there such thing as a truth that isn't contextual? Is there such thing as a universal truth that will never not be true? What do you guys think?
I have an idea, or theory, that is.
Shoot, I'm tired of talking. My voice hurts.
Um, so you know how we can only be talking about something if we exist, but we can't talk about something if we don't exist or we're dead. So if we say that we're alive in the moment that we're alive, it's impossible to say that we're dead in the moment that we're dead.
Mm-hmm.
So, hmm. Then that's just about subjective truth, then, not contextual truth. Never mind.
Yeah, no, it's about, is there such thing as objective truth? Is there something that you could say is always true? Kind of reminds me of that old parable that says, like, the three wise men that came to the king, and he said, "Give me a phrase that will always be true." And they said, "This too shall pass away."
That's what I was going to say. The only thing that I can possibly think of, and I can't really prove it, would be that the changing nature of experience, like that's the only thing I could say is like a permanent thing. That the actual impermanence is
The only thing that's
is it.
permanent.
Yeah, and there's no way to prove that, but that seems to be the only thing I could point to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it might be, there's facts that make you want to say, well, this will always be true, like that, the fact that Einstein invented special relativity theory. I can't think of anything that's going to change that, because it's already happened and we can't go back and change it. You could say that it wasn't true before it happened, but it's not something that will ever not be true now, unless, I suppose, we discovered some books that showed that Einstein was a complete fraud and stole all his ideas from someone else, which is technically possible. Um, but yeah, so contextualism basically says all of knowledge works in this way. It's all relative to the context that we're talking about it in. It doesn't mean if I say it's raining right now, there's a situation where someone might equally truly say it's not raining right now. If we include, in the city that I'm in, if they're standing next to me and they say it's not raining, you might argue that in the context of now, it is objectively raining.
Well, there is one thing that doesn't change, and no matter what moment you would be in, unless there's a decision where it is changed. But for now, it's truth that like for example conceptual ideas, like for example math and science and uh, I don't know, some something as simple as that, where 2 plus 2 equals 4. Even though I said that in the past, I can say it again and it would still be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and is there ever a situation where 2 plus 2 will not equal 4 in this reality? Is that an objective truth? Math is a great example, actually.
Well, we can't say that. We can't say if that they would change it because we don't know the future.
Mm-hmm.
But if for now all we can say is that it is 2 plus 2.
Yeah, and Descartes would say, it's even possible that, as instinctive as it is that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that we have been tricked by this demon, and that 2 plus 2 doesn't really equal 4. The demon just wants us to believe that it does, so we just do.
What
That's
demon?
illogical.
So Descartes had this theory of this demon that has trapped us in basically a matrix, and that nothing around us is real. And he said if the demon really wanted to, it could make us think that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that a square has 4 sides, when in the reality that the demon lives in, our intuition would tell us that a square has 6 sides, and that 2 plus 2 equals 10 or whatever. And
the demon's name wouldn't happen to be Laplace, would it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So
But is the universe not infinite?
nobody's saying that this is the case. It's just sort of a thought experiment. Just saying this could be true, and there would be no way of you knowing, in a sense.
Then why question it?
So in one of these videos, the Academy of Ideas video, towards the end, he brings about the idea that people might begin to question the nature of reality around them and whether or not it's real. And we know that people do this. People have been doing this since the ancient Greeks, obviously, because of these examples. The most recent example in our time is The Matrix, and that movie was so appealing to people because it said the reality around you is not real. You are in a dream. And that's, people ate that up. There's something very appealing about this concept. And so in this video, towards the end, they said that one of the reasons this might be so appealing to us in some ways is fear. Fear as an impetus to epistemology. Fear that we are lost in the cosmos with tools like our senses that are just inadequate to help us with knowledge. We don't have explanations for why things happen. We don't understand the truth about meaning or purpose in life. We've basically been thrown into this existence without an understanding of it, and that fear makes us question all of it, including our own reality, our own perceptions of reality, and the fundamental structure of it. So here's a quote from Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison that says, "All epistemology begins in fear. Fear that the senses are too feeble and the intellect too frail. Fear that memory fades even between adjacent steps of a mathematical demonstration. Fear that authority and convention blinds. Fear that God may keep secrets or demons deceive." Another quote related to this is from Blaise Pascal, and it says, and this is very poetic, "Swallowed up in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I know nothing, and which know nothing of me, I take fright." And basically what this is saying is that our limitations of our senses and our intelligence create a kind of fear that for some people will eventually begin to wonder if there is anything that we can know at all, especially when in our lives we come across something that we thought we knew 100%, and we are faced with a sharp realization that we did not know what we thought we knew.
Sounds like they're not afraid of what they don't know, but rather if they don't know it, they won't have security.
And I mean,
And
why are we all here? Why do we read books on existence? Why do we study the nature of reality? Why do we have these Sunday discussions? It's because there is something in us that wants to know, not just to guess, not just to wonder. And this goes back to the quote I opened the talk with from Aristotle, which is, Let me pull it up here. All men by nature desire to know. And this is why people study sciences, and it's what brings people to philosophy. Philosophy is the love of, what is it, wisdom? Now I'm forgetting. Truth.
Yes, truth.
Yeah, love of truth. Philo is love, Sophia is truth. So in a way, all of us go through this. All of us started with some assumptions in our lives that were just illusions, and those illusions became apparent probably around when we were teenagers, and that's when we began to question things, and that's why stories like The Matrix appeal so much, because it makes us question all of these things we assume that we know.
Either that or we're just really bored.
Yeah, I think it's good to question it at least once, and then to realize that it doesn't matter whether or not this is reality, because it's where we are now, and so it's our reality. And I think that this is why I like Buddhism so much, because Buddhism is addressing the seeking of knowledge, the insecurity of not knowing. And I think it's one of the things that I've really loved about, I think Zen goes into this, and I believe Taoism does as well, is that you won't know everything. These aren't really answers. The answer is to love the questions themselves, to embrace the fear of not knowing, and then that fear dissipates because you love not knowing. That doesn't mean that knowledge itself isn't possible or isn't obtainable, but it's just always going to be limited. And once we are aware that all of our knowledge is in some way limited and could be flawed, we have a better understanding of ourselves and an acceptance. I think that it leads to an acceptance of the things we can't know, the limitations that we have, and it gives us some ground to stand on. Cool, well, that was my talk on epistemology. I know that this is, the reason I wanted to do epistemology was because what can we know comes up a lot in other subjects. And when we look at that question, this is epistemology. What can we know? How do we know that meditation leads to this state of mind we've been talking about? How do we know that the yin is balanced by the yang? How do we know that any of what we're saying is true? We're basing it on our sensory perceptions, our memories and experiences, things we've read that other people say. All of these things are limited, and epistemology would say that balancing your limited sensory perception with your reason is really the best way forward. And so anytime it comes up that we're talking about something and someone says, well, how do you know? Hopefully this foundation of knowledge will, going forward, prevent these kinds of questions, because we will understand the limitations of knowledge, and we don't have to ask, well, do you have objective, omniscient, total knowledge of the situation? Because none of us do, and that's okay. We have limited knowledge that we work with and go from there, and that allows all of us to be open to those limitations, to be aware of them, and that allows us to get a more accurate picture.
I don't know if this was talked about before I got or jumped in, but did you ever talk about if you should seek security in knowledge?
Um, we talked about why people do. Um, should you seek security? No, because if you become aware of your limitations of knowledge, that makes an insecurity. Because only if you knew 100% of the possible knowledge about something could you be secure. Because then you'd have 100% of the available knowledge. If you're missing even 0.001%, but that missing knowledge changes the nature of what you think you understand, you're in an insecure, unstable place. Even if you believe you have 100%, if you don't really, you're going to be insecure, and that missing percentage might come up in the future and change things. So, to seek security in knowledge would be vain because total objective knowledge is not possible.
I remember sitting in meditation, and this started to take up the awareness as my object. I just started looking at that closely and being like, okay, how do I know that I'm aware? You know, there is this sense, but how do I know that? And the only thing that I could say is that I know that I am because I am, or I know that I know that I know that I know on infinitely.
Yeah, it circles
And
around
beyond,
itself.
yeah, it doesn't go anywhere, and it doesn't go out, and it's just an infinite circle. But beyond that, outside of that is there's nothing. There's nothing concrete, reliable, and you can still use information outside of that, useful to navigate reality. And you can be, it is relatively reliable. If I do something, there's this thing that will happen. But to know something beyond that, beyond just knowing that I am, it's you said security, like that's about as close to security as you can really get to. And like Lauren was saying, it's almost like you become secure with or comfortable with this not knowing. and it's okay, like you're just okay with that. That's about as all you can know. And I think that is, we're just curious. We just, for some reason, whatever we are is it's just a curious thing. It wants to know, it wants to seek, and it's like fun. It's like a game to itself. But part of that game is to take it extremely serious. This is very serious. we can't pretend like that this is a joke, or that we all have to be very serious, put on our serious face, and there's real problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is why it becomes a Buddhist aspect for me, because it becomes about accepting the fact that we can't know everything, and that anything we think we know could be limited. It doesn't mean that all of our knowledge is belief, And it doesn't mean that belief is the same thing as knowledge, but it does mean that we become open to being wrong, and that's okay. As soon as we accept that we don't know everything, we accept that we could be wrong, and that turns all of the things that we think we know from concreteness into a more fluid idea. And that's what allows us to change our minds about things we might not otherwise change, to reevaluate things we thought we were sure about, to embrace new ideas that have outgrown older, staler ideas. And if we don't accept that we might be wrong and that knowledge is limited, we won't grow into these new ideas. I think that meditation is very fascinating for this reason, because when you meditate, you are just going into sensory experience without thought. And it doesn't become about what you think about what's happening. It's just, you just become a kind of receiver for these signals. And it's the most direct experience that I can think of that has the least distortion possible. And I still think there is still some distortion, because let's say you're colorblind. You're seeing the world, but you're seeing a distorted version from someone who has the ability to see color. And even someone who can see color can't see the entire spectrum. So we have this limited, distorted perception, but we're still that receiver. And when we meditate and let go of our thoughts and ideas, everything that's streaming into us in that moment is as direct and straightforward of a reality as I think it's possible to get.
Yeah, with what you have available, that's about as close as you can get. And there was me and B were talking the other night, and there was something that I brought up, and I thought it was pretty good, but after she was talking to me, I was kind of like, oh yeah, I didn't think about that part. But this was this idea. I'm sure somebody has come up with this. I think maybe I probably picked it up from somebody else. This isn't my idea, but it's that how do you know that a color like red is the same for everybody?
Yeah.
You can reliably say that when you see red, that you're seeing the exact same color everybody else is seeing, because we are human beings and relatively our bodies are constructed in the same way. And so, you're very likely to see the same color. But there's also another chance that you're not actually seeing the same color, that you were taught in school that the color that you see as red is red, but to somebody else it could be blue, but you would have no idea that was any different. Me and her used red and gray, but I think that might have been a mistake, because she brought up mixing colors. If you can't take red and gray and it turn into what another color would be. But if you took and said, okay, gray and black and white are the same for everybody, but the actual colors could be different, then mixing would still have the same effect, that you could be seeing a color that is different from everybody else. I don't know if I'm explaining that very good, but that's
yeah, it's correct. Like, people colorblind, I think it's red and brown that they predominantly struggle with.
Yeah, this happens with people who are colorblind pretty often, where they'll go most of their lives without knowing that they're colorblind. Like that pretty famous scene in Little Miss Sunshine where the guy wants to be a fighter pilot when he grows up, and then during their trip in the van, he learns that he's colorblind and that he'll never be a pilot for that reason. And he went his whole life thinking that he was seeing the same colors that everybody else was seeing.
So that just kind of goes into knowledge and knowing. Like, how do you know? How could you know something? You can't, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I would say we can know things to an extent. That knowledge will always be limited because of these hidden sort of twists that might be true. You might be in the Matrix, you might be colorblind, there might be something else you are completely unaware of that turns the entire world on its head. But barring these unknown, in philosophy it's called defeaters of what you think you know, I do think that limited knowledge is still a kind of knowledge. I can know that I'm sitting at a desk right now. It could be a dream desk, it could be a Matrix desk, it could be an animal disguised as a desk. I don't know that it's not, but I know enough to safely say that when I say I'm sitting at a desk, it's a true fact. Whatever that desk is made of or entails doesn't change the fact that when I refer to it, it is the object in front of me that I'm referring to, and that makes it still a fact.
In that sense, I actually was going to ask this earlier, but in a situation like that, would it make more sense to say that I sense something in front of me rather than I know there's something in front of me? Because
isn't that down to interpretation, though?
Interpretation?
right,
Yeah,
but
to yourself.
isn't that what sense is? Personal view, point of view, interpretation. That's how you see it.
Yeah, you could
Yeah,
say that
I would say so.
my senses are telling me there's a desk here, and therefore because of my sensory input, I have knowledge that there is a desk here. Senses could be distorted in some way or inaccurate.
But it wouldn't be related to that kind of permanent knowledge.
Right, because it might not be true.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. This could be a very complicated animal disguised as a desk.
It's a mimic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Bertrand Russell will say that type of doubt is good to keep in mind, that 1 or 2%, everything I think I know could be wrong, but don't waste too much time on it because common sense tells us this is a desk, it's made of wood, and it's real. Common sense also tells me I'm not dreaming right now. I could be wrong because when you're in a dream you don't realize you're dreaming, but we also intuitively know when we're in reality and when we're not, and we intuitively know this is real right now, and my hand is a real object in the external world.
Yeah, basically basically reality still works, and so you can reliably know certain things. If you take an object and you drop it, it's going to fall. Like, that doesn't change anything. But to know beyond that, like, how is this happening? What is it? Like, that is sort of the mystery. And I don't think you can really know. You can have amazing guesses, but yeah, this doesn't really affect sort of like your daily life, your reality, but it can be fun to, investigate and question. But things still just work as they work in reality.
Yeah, so basically reality is still here, and we don't know what it's made up of, and we don't know if we're dreaming or not, and we could all be butterflies dreaming that we're people right now. And it's okay to not have all of the knowledge, and just because we don't know that we're not all butterflies doesn't mean that we don't also know that I'm a human at a desk right now, because right now that is what's true. So yeah, I mean, it's a fun exercise to do. I think it does have a use because it teaches us the limits of our knowledge, and it helps us see those limits and understand them, and understand that anything we think we know isn't complete, and we should have a shadow of a doubt open to us, to being wrong, to being misled, to not perceiving things in the right way. It's okay to have that doubt. I would even say it's intellectually healthy.
Yeah, I agree.
And this is why I like virtue ethics, and I would like to kind of end with that. I probably should have saved it for last. There was also another interesting, there's a video that June shared of what's called street epistemology, and I've watched a few of these videos before you shared that, June, and it's pretty good. It's this guy basically goes around to people on the street, and he walks up to them and he asks them about their beliefs, and then he says, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that you know this is a fact? And usually people have a bit of doubt, even religious people, and it's a pretty good video series. I like watching it. Some people are, you know, 100% confident, but usually, and he's good about the way he questions things, but usually after a while he'll kind of throw up questions in this way where people are like, okay, well, you know, I suppose I could be wrong, so I'm like a 9 out of 10, or, you know, whatever. So that was a good video that June shared, where basically the guy goes up to this girl named Emily and asks her about hell, and man, I feel bad for that girl because I feel like he probably made her question being a Christian. It was a great video. But yeah, so I want to end on virtue ethics, which is basically, which I mentioned before, what is ethical, what is an ethical form of thinking? What is a virtuous type of analysis of knowledge, and what is an unvirtuous one? The easy example from To Kill a Mockingbird is racism. Racism is an example of an intellectual vice. And virtue epistemology is about recognizing that we have intellectual vices and prejudices. Another branch of philosophy would call them logical fallacies. And that when we become aware of these things, we can improve our process of knowledge and analysis of the world around us, and that we can that it's an ethical thing to do this, that it is a matter of right and wrong, in terms of how we know what we think we know. Now, Mike, in Buddhism, there is no right and wrong. Is that somewhat correct?
Yeah, somewhat. It's more of, it is natural consequences, sort of.
Mm-hmm. I've also
They
heard... Go ahead.
they call it karma. Karma, that's their explanation. So, cause and effect, and then the consequences of the cause and effect would be considered karma.
Yeah, and that we don't really know whether those consequences are good or bad because we can't see what might happen. One of the famous stories that Alan Watts talks about is the Chinese farmer whose son finds a wild horse, and all of the villagers say, wow, that's really great. And the Chinese farmer says, maybe it's great, maybe it's not. And then the son is training the horse and falls and breaks his legs, and all the villagers say, wow, that's terrible. And he says, maybe. And then the army comes to recruit, and the son can't go because he's hurt. And they say, oh, that's great. And he says, maybe, and etc., etc. And so you can't really know if something is good or bad in that light of it. And I think that is how Buddhism looks at it, because, and I suppose this could come back to objective knowledge, if you don't know what's going to happen, how can you know whether it's good or bad? Does that make sense to everybody?
I love that story.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I would say that you're right. You can't know what objectively is good or bad. But if you're trying to weigh like a decision, I think you could say, if I do A, then B may happen. And if you're okay with B happening, then there wouldn't be like that wouldn't be considered bad. Like I could go extreme with it. Say you wanted to kill somebody, and you can go, okay, if I do this, then there's a very good chance I will go to jail and prison, and in prison, a number of things will probably happen that I won't enjoy. But if you sort of accept that, like, okay, that's very likely going to happen, then then it wouldn't really be considered bad. I mean, to you, if you're willing to accept the consequences. To a lot of other people, they would say that's not good, that's not bad. That may throw up a lot of questions and feelings.
Yeah, I think, what is that saying? Nothing is good or bad except thinking makes it so. I don't think that means that there isn't good or bad. I think it's just that it is, I suppose we could go into contextualism. It's in context of our minds and what we're seeking. So if you're seeking to be a person who can move around freely in the world, it would be bad to go to jail because you've lost the freedom to move around freely. If you are seeking to be in the jail, then it would be a good thing to go. I'm not sure, however, and this is why I bring this up, is I'm not sure if it's the same as intellectual virtue, because I think what they mean by intellectual virtue is that, I'll just stick with the racism thing here, it is an intellectual vice to be racist, and there is no way in which you might see that trait in a good way, except maybe by accident, where if someone was racist and it accidentally caused the person they were racist towards to have something good happen to them, I'm sure we could think of some convoluted example that might lead to that, but they would say that the effects aren't what matters, it's the process of thinking, and there's a good way to think and a bad way to think, essentially, and that when we practice intellectual virtue, we are seeking to eliminate the bad ways of thinking and only practice a good process of thinking. And in that way, even if you came to a wrong conclusion, you will do it virtuously, which is all anybody can ask of you.
I would say that good and bad don't necessarily exist because of the same reason that you brought up, that we, as long as we're seeking for something or that we have a goal in mind, there would be pros and cons to every event that would happen along the way. But I would also say that good and bad exists comparatively. So when you decide to say that what bear is best, you could argue that the polar bear is better because they have better thermal resistance. You can say that a brown bear is better because they can fish more effectively. But the problem is that when you have such a small scope, you can almost trick yourself.
This reminds me of that koan that the koan is which piece of meat is the best in the store, and the owner responds, they're all the best. And then the monk in the store is enlightened. All the koans end with the monk being enlightened. Instead of confused. Yeah. Now, I don't know if that applies to intellectual virtue, because intellectual virtue is more of a verb. It's more of a process. It's not, is this fact good or bad? Is this polar bear good or bad? Is this fact that my son broke his legs good or bad? It's
unless you introduce the verb comparison or comparing.
Yeah. You'd have to, as soon as you say something's good, you're comparing it to its opposite, which would be bad. You're creating the bad as soon as you create the good, and which is Taoism. But with
personally to you.
Yeah. But with intellectual virtue, their question is wisdom good? Is curiosity good? Is it good to practice questioning your own prejudices? And in that way it becomes more of a verb, where we might say the verb implies a process. So let's say with a physical thing like meditation, is it better to use meditation or alcohol to get to a clear mind state? These aren't things that are subjective. There's no way in which you could look at it and say, alcohol's better. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, that depends on the experience, I guess, from the person. I mean, you could hit rock bottom on alcohol and thereby realize that this is not working for me.
Let me rephrase it then. Is it better to get to a sober mindset by drinking alcohol or drinking water?
Oh, that's a given then.
Yeah, so I think intellectual virtue would say the same thing, sort of like, is it better to get to knowledge by using racism or curiosity?
Depends on what your goal in mind is.
Well, yeah, that's actually a really good point.
If you're just trying to be a dick, then you would go for racism, obviously.
Yeah, the verb implies that you're moving towards something, and I would say the goal would be knowledge, in the way that the goal in my previous example was sobriety.
Right, but there are different forms of knowledge, like, for example, practical knowledge. And if you decide what is practical, let's say you want to be the most horrendous human being as possible, you would try to see what offends people.
Right, but being the most offensive person isn't knowledge.
Unless you have a definition of practical knowledge. If you have a personal definition of what practical knowledge is, anything can be practical.
Yeah, we went over the difference between practical and propositional knowledge earlier, and mostly what we're talking about is propositional, which is about a fact. So let's say if the goal is knowledge and it's propositional knowledge, it wouldn't be about the type of person you want to be. The goal would be about what is the truth. And if your goal is what is the truth, then holding on to a prejudice like racism would keep you from that goal. It's kind of like saying if the goal is silence, then speaking won't get you there.
So would you say all of this really comes down to whatever goal you're shooting for?
No, I'm not saying that. I guess I didn't understand the original question, but
I would say it is because, what we're talking about is virtue ethics. Is there such thing as a virtuous way of thinking? So, this implies good and bad. Is there such thing as a good way of thinking and a bad way of thinking? And in order to answer that, you have to ask what is the goal. And the goal of thinking about something would, in my opinion, be knowledge of it, or the truth. If you're going to think about whether or not this person is guilty or this fact is true, it all comes back to how do you investigate this? How do you go about knowing the answer to this question? And is there a good way of going about it? And is there an ethically bad way of going about it?
Well, yeah. If that is your goal, then yes, there is a good and a bad way of going about that.
I actually have a thought that just came to me. Let's say there is a God, and this thing designed everything in the universe and created everything. And he, or it, I should say it has created this plan of, and this goal that all living beings should strive after. That would, now, if we're talking about God, would it be fair to say that what it says is objective truth? Or is it still subjective because it's still coming from something?
Have to be subjective still.
That's what I think.
Yeah, you're talking about knowledge that comes from God?
Not knowledge that comes from God, but the God decides that this is the thing that you should do. And it's the truth of the world, maybe, but still, it's not exactly. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this question of ethics is about what should we do. When we talk about normal ethics, we say, what should our actions be? What is the right action and what is a wrong action? When we talk about virtue epistemology, it's the same thing, but with your thinking. What is a good process of thinking and what is a bad process of thinking? So it's the same way. It's the same question, but instead of your external actions, the question is, what is ethical thinking internally in my head? What is good thought or a good process of thought, and what is a bad one? An ethical injustice might be killing someone or robbing someone. An intellectual injustice would be using your knowledge in a bad way, or maybe resisting knowledge.
Shit. Fuck. I had a thought.
So you would say, for instance, that with this jury that convicted the black man of raping this woman, that their ethical failing was convicting him, but it began as an intellectual failing of the racism, where they couldn't believe what he was saying just because he was black. And so I suppose you could connect them all as a type of ethics, but what virtue epistemology is trying to say is that there's a process of thinking that is virtuous and ethical that we should follow. This is about what should you do and what shouldn't you do, and virtue epistemology is what ways should you think and what ways shouldn't you think.
Would this virtuous way of thinking be highly based on the nature of reality itself?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's about seeing reality clearly, and we can tie this back into Buddhism as well, because it's about seeing as clearly as you can without prejudices, and thoughts can become prejudiced. Thoughts can distort our reality, which is why I think Buddhists try to see reality without using thought.
So then, in that context, that if we're following along that, where thought would be considered obstructive, then what type of knowledge should we seek? The one that we formulate through what we sense in the world? Like, if we take an apple and we let go of it at a certain height, that it will fall because we see that happening?
Yeah, I think this comes back to awareness, right? Like, if I assume that the apple will fall the same way every time, it's a safe assumption to have for apples and gravity, but if I assume that a person will act the same way every time, it's less of a safe assumption because people are more complicated and they're not ruled by these mathematical formulas as much like gravity is. So,
Well, it's not a mathematical formula, it's just a event.
gravity,
Yeah.
isn't it a formula? G equals...
Well, I mean, there is a formula for it, but gravity is not made up of a formula.
Oh. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess it's a force. Yeah, so I mean, part of awareness would be being aware that even your senses can fail you. So if you are just aware of your senses and you take those as 100% true, but you're not aware that your eyes might be deceiving you or your ears might be deceiving you and what you're hearing isn't what you think you're hearing, if you're not aware of that, you could make a faulty assumption. You could have false knowledge. So intellectual virtues would be awareness that included that kind of awareness. Awareness that you could be wrong about things, that your senses could be wrong. I think another intellectual virtue would probably be curiosity. Because if you're not curious about what the truth is and whether or not you understand it, you're not going to go out seeking more information.
This may be irrelevant, but something that came to my mind that kind of makes this a bit more complicated is experience. So, like, a person could have an experience of a majority of people being racist towards them, and this would create a very strong belief and knowledge that this is how it is, and so they wouldn't their thinking process or what they would expect would be sort of influenced, and so that it would be difficult for them to think in this way, in this sort of ethical, logical way.
Yeah. Past experiences are definitely a bias and can be distorted as well. Every time you access a memory, so they say, you change it a little bit with your mind, so your memories become more flawed. So when you rely on your memory, I know that person X told me that the party was at 7:30, but your memory is flawed and you're mixing it up with something someone else told you, you could think you have knowledge, but you don't, because our memory is probably more flawed than our current senses and perception. Actually, almost surely it is.
I'll agree. It's never quite the same, is it?
I'd say that's just because we have so many images running through our minds that we end up picking out how do I say this? The most bright thing. The most
salient,
attractive idea or images.
You mean from our memory?
Right, yeah. Like if I'm thinking about something, like for example, what I had this morning, and I start trying to remember it, I end up not only I see images of myself at the dining room table eating the breakfast that I had, but I also have images of TV shows that I watched, or characters that I liked, or this question I was trying to ask before. Or I would have some thoughts running through my head where it's basically a repeat, or music maybe.
No, that's a very interesting question, guys. Like some of the best people in the world that have excellent memory, they learn to train the brain with setting out specific photographic memory. So, just for example, there's like a soccer ball, and they would be able to just pinpoint a soccer ball in this room over everything else, and then they can gather the rest of the story, but by pinpointing from getting the information off this, like specific soccer ball, and then it all like sort of meets together.
Like a lot of memory is like associative in nature. So when you do like lookups, kind of doing it with a context, so the most salient features will be like somewhat what you become aware of, and your brain does a lot of filtering in certain regions that connect to your memory centers. So it's intelligent and it's efficient to like forget things or to not make the whole memory important. I'd probably even say people who like retrain their brains to have extreme memory, you're probably doing more harm than good when it comes to that. Like we have technology that allows you to externalize that. So kind of like causing your brain to retain things that aren't important isn't really a good feature.
Right, but we don't know our own capacity. So how could we fairly say that our brains can't handle it?
Physical systems have a capacity. Whether you're hitting that limit or not is pretty clear just by way of aging. You're not going to retain all of your memory, no matter how hard you try.
I have heard that the level of visual and auditory memory in our brains is like insane amounts of terabytes of information. So our capacity is pretty high. It's probably a pretty big ceiling before we'd hit it. There are people who have memory palaces they use to accurately remember things. You could be wrong. It's memory, and that's where this doubt comes in. How do you know just because you remember it? Probably all of us here have experienced a time where we remembered something different from a friend of ours, and then you suddenly find you're not really sure what did happen. Was it person X that said that?
Not only that, not only do we have memory techniques, but there's a difference between technology and us. We are alive, and therefore we have the capacity to grow ourselves. So we have essentially an unlimited carrying capacity, or unlimited potential for capacity, that is, because our brains can grow.
You don't.
What?
You don't. I'll give you a simple test. If you can, on your computer, record
I'm
like
not
60 frames per
suggesting that I
second.
have this, okay? I'm
Nobody
not
does.
suggesting that I have an unlimited memory. I'm saying that there's a potential to have an unlimited memory, but we don't know that because there hasn't been a human that's been alive since the beginning of time.
Would
We
suggest you
only.
don't.
What suggests that I don't have a carrying capacity?
He said which.
That would suggest, since there's no human being who does, it would suggest you don't have unlimited memory, and everybody's memory degrades like with time. So,
Well,
physical systems that are alive are actually somewhat like less capable than like even computer systems in terms of how long data can be stored. So,
because of
no, it's
but that's for
it's
those.
a good thing that you forget. It's not a bad thing. So, I think going to an extreme of like memory retention really doesn't. Why are you attempting to, for instance, why would you want a photographic memory? Most things aren't important to remember every detail, which is why you don't store it. It would be similar to if you ran a capture program on your computer on a 100 gig hard drive. Like by the end of the day, you would probably like literally like use all of the capacity on a hard drive. So there's reasons to forget things, and our brains are nature is very efficient. So forgetting is one of the key underpinnings of intelligence, and the intelligence algorithm is figuring out what's important and what's not and forgetting it without you even being conscious of it.
Yeah, usually it's forgetting in order to make way for something else to remember. And there are things that, there's a reason you would want to remember things. There are days in your life that you might want to purposefully remember, and there are techniques you can use to increase your ability to recall and remember those days. So for instance, my friends got married last fall, and they both really wanted to remember every moment of the day, and so they looked up these memory techniques, and it was kind of meditation. It was bringing yourself back into the present moment, noting the things that were going on around you and labeling them, and regularly doing that so that every moment you weren't lost in thought about the past or the future. You were in that moment with the people around you at the time. So there are reasons you would want to remember things, and reasons you would want to do that accurately, especially if you were trying to recall something that was important, that you've decided is important ethically or important to you personally. You might want to remember it. The movie Memento. But yeah, memory is flawed, and that's part of what we need to be aware of, is that it's flawed and that it can limit our knowledge, and that something we think we know through memory might not actually be knowledge or might be incomplete.
A good question to ask would be if there is an inherent goal to existence itself. Not what is the meaning of life, but is there something that's happening right now, or something that I can see right now that basically can answer that question?
We can certainly make a goal for our existence.
Right, we can make one, but is there something that we could see right now that would answer that question?
Probably like live, learn, live and let live, experience life, be nice to people, do unto others as you want done unto you. All these basic principles of like orienting yourself towards goodness, I guess, and good experiences more than bad experiences, and then bestowing that upon others. I think if you were to say if there's some general trend to everybody's life, it would be that. And from there, you can maybe work backwards to some type of moral framework.
You could also
guidance.
You could point out the purely physical, observable, and objective trend of complexity over time. That's undeniable, unless we live in a matrix and the universe was created 2 hours ago. Everything has been moving, as far as we quote-unquote know, from a simple state to a more complex state over time. And so in terms of that trend, you could theoretically say that anything that went against complexity, such as taking a life, could be bad, and then anything that helped improve that complexity would be good, simply because it is the observable trend of existence around us.
That could be added in. I like that.
You would have to also figure out which perspective, if you're saying, is there a goal to reality, to life? From which position are you looking from?
The only one that I have.
So from your perspective as a human being.
Right.
I'll be right back.
So, yeah, then if that is the perspective you're taking on for this question, then it would be kind of, again, back to the goal. What do you want? What is your goal?
I'll be right back.
Right, but my question is related to the idea of virtuous knowledge. How is there something that is what is the objective goal of the universe? And my question was asking if it's possible to see that goal right now. Like as I'm sitting here, is there is there a certain aspect or a certain collision between aspects of reality that I can see that would help formulate that goal?
I mean, just loosely speaking, it's like progress is a constant. Like progress towards more knowledge, more understanding of yourself, more understanding of others, more understanding of how we all fit together as a system. These are also trends, I would say, that are pretty steeped in like human history. So if you're looking for like orientation, one aspect is doing good, one aspect is contributing to this progress, helping others contribute as well, et cetera, et cetera. So there's so many, in my opinion, arrows that would help you orient yourself along even a very varied spectrum that I don't see how it's questionable. I don't think it's subjective either.
The problem with your answers is that if we are asking the question, what is inherently good and what is the goal of the universe, then we can't assume that what we've already gathered from other scenarios, other goals that we've created ourselves, we can't assume that they have any relevance, right?
To me, like if I were to say if there was some systems goal or trend, I would essentially look at like the average. So the things that don't fit that are outliers in my mind. Outliers in the sense that they were tried, they didn't really catch traction. So those aren't the pathways to go.
Right. But how are you able to? Where are you getting this average?
Thousands of years of human history, religion, sociology. Like basically take a measure of every society's civilization. What their culture was, what their laws were, what their frameworks were for being. Look at technology, look at everything around you, and you'll see a bunch of arrows pointing in a similar direction.
So the goal becomes a stable society or a community?
Stable, fair society that people can live out their choices. If you believe in such a thing, their free will. Things that maximize that aren't to the detriment of the broader society's goal to be fair and progressive in terms of understanding the universe, ourselves, our place in it, how to utilize it for furthering our race and our exploration of the universe itself. So I think all of these things are consistent.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm going to have to nitpick with you for a second here because you were talking about how memory it's okay to forget things, and how you shouldn't have to remember everything. And I'm like relating that to how you have knowledge of 1,000 years of human history. I mean, I'm not saying that you do, but that is what you said.
Well, in your own brain, right? Because your brain is limited, and you don't have control really over what your brain really forgets and things. You can try to override it with exercises, but most of it's subconscious. So beyond that, we have technology now. Have had it for thousands of years in order to record memory. And basically, I'm saying use that. Don't try to like force your brain to do something that it's more efficiently aligned towards doing, especially when you can utilize technology, storage, all of this stuff to do it. So I'm not against like memory. I'm against
so
like.
I assume you've gained your conclusion through technology, right? Since that would be the more superior way to gain an answer.
Books, writing, all of this stuff. That's the
And
only way you can know about like what happened in history potentially.
And you're the one that synthesized this answer?
I think we all do. I don't really even think someone does anything different.
Well,
They can claim they
your
do.
own answers.
I mean, for me personally, yeah, I could just speak for myself. That's how I do it.
Right. But what I'm trying to get at is how I was saying before, that if we are having the question, if we're asking the question, if there is an inherent goal of the universe, and we're unsure as to what it is, we can't. How can we point relevance to how people should get along, if that's relevant to the goal, or if we should be more nice to animals, or respectful to how we treat our environment, how if we should be developing renewable technologies, or we should just keep polluting. If we're having to ask the question, what is inherently good, then how can we assume anything that we've known at that point would be relevant to the question?
I think because, like, again, you take this summation of history, you look at the present's dynamics, you do projections of present dynamics into the future, which we all do. You decide whether or not that's the future you want, and then you orient your actions towards it. So, in my mind, at any given present snapshot, what simply is. It's not wrong, it's not right, it just simply is. And so where we end up 5 years from now is dependent upon how much thought we put into predicting that and deciding on that prediction whether or not that's where we want to be. So if you then take a study across 1,000 years, you see cycles. In those cycles, you do see still even more like a steady progress. Then you attempt to forward that progress as long as it's within this ender goal you want to achieve for some time. You're never going to have a crystal ball. You're never going to be able to say what's the world's going to be in 500 years.
We're not talking about subjective truth or subjective goals. We're talking about the objective goal.
No, you're never going to know exactly what that is. You're going to have a rough idea. Like I said, I think, yeah.
Right. So
that's neither right or wrong.
Because we don't know what that objective truth is, how do we know what objective truth? That's what I was asking.
This is why I brought the subject up of epistemology, because it's how do we know?
You never will.
Yeah.
Like, according to quantum physics, you literally will never know. So the thing is to pick the best choice and go with it. I don't think you're ever going to get anything better than that, unless you're saying the universe is deterministic and you can figure out the formula for where we'll be in the future, which would preclude the whole concept. If you could predict the future, you could change the future, which we can't. It's a paradox. So I don't know. We'll never know it. I'm okay with that. You just try to get the best idea, the best framing you can, and you just go with it so that you can fulfill the future or manifest the future that you want to see. So
Yeah.
I think that's the more apt. That's the pinnacle to me.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, our predictions will get better, but that's the pinnacle thing you can do is orient your actions towards the future you predict.
Yeah, and good and bad only really become relevant and applicable as soon as we have a goal. And so if the goal becomes a stable society or a certain type of future, or if the goal is knowledge itself, suddenly there's a good way to get there and a bad way to get there. And until we have that goal, I don't think there is an objective good or bad, because you can always look at it in a different way. You know, is it good or bad that the lion eats the gazelle? It's bad for the gazelle, good for the lion. Depends on where you're standing and what your goals are.
I think when that term evil was introduced into the world, it was probably the most convoluted term to ever exist, because it presupposes you know exactly what the future is and what is good and what that path towards that should be. And clearly we never have gotten that. People have claimed God told them, but clearly that's contestable. But yeah, good, bad, evil, all that great stuff. It helps when you're trying to reason through the dynamics or compel yourself or others down certain paths. But ultimately, yeah, nobody knows where this whole thing is going. We have good ideas or guesses,
Right.
but nobody knows.
But that was the question that that Lauren brought up about virtuous knowledge. If there is something that you can know, that would be
Yeah,
effective.
we did address whether or not there is such thing as objective knowledge, and I think Mike said the only thing we can really think of that's true at all times is that everything changes. It's just impermanence, and that's always true no matter what. Nothing lasts, even when you think it's lasting. Even if you look at a solid object on your desk and you think this is not changing, it actually is.
Yeah. Also, just physics is pretty consistent. So
math is another one we brought up. Is 2 + 2 always been 4? Will it always be 4? Is there anything that might change that?
The thing is,
no.
I have another question to ask.
I could actually answer that.
Axioms preclude it, so don't.
Is the question asking knowledge of the future?
Hang on, I want to hear Mike's answer about 2 + 2.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Okay, so the question is 2 + 2, will that always be 4? And this seems silly, but my answer would be no, that it wouldn't always be 4, because if there isn't something there to measure it, then it wouldn't be.
Oh, this is like the axioms of mathematics, where there's a proof that will never change, because that's the way they made mathematics. So,
like, if you took the human out of it, then there wouldn't be an answer.
That's because mathematics is just a formally decided structure. So,
right,
as they have made mathematics, 2 will always equal 4. So you can look up the proof for it that establishes that. So essentially, like the summation, like plus and equals, right? They preclude what you're suggesting.
Yeah, as soon as you have the equal sign, you have to have both sides. You can't have just the 2 + 2, because it is the same as the 4 on the other side. They kind of arise simultaneously.
But Zen, do you, when you say it, as long as there is a measurement, it'll always equal 4, but if you take that measurement out, it won't? Do you mean by that, if you take the human out of it, it won't equal 4 anymore?
Well, I guess then it would just depend on whether you believe that the universe would still exist without you being aware of it. If that is the case, then 2 + 2 will always equal 4. But if there isn't something there to be aware of it, then it doesn't exist anymore, and so therefore you can't have 2 + 2 equaling 4.
If a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it make a sound?
That's like asking.
I know it's kind of a slippery little trick, but I mean, I don't know.
That's like saying, if asking me, "Hey, when I die, can you say that you're dead for me?" Because then, if I could, I wouldn't be dead. Maybe that didn't click.
This is duality, I think, because it requires an ear to hear the sound, and sound doesn't exist without an ear to hear it. And in the same way, the equals sign of an equation implies both sides of it, and you can't have one side of an equation any more than you could have a one-sided coin.
I mean, if you want to inquire about like it's the mathematical reference to like whether the universe exists if you still aren't here is a little bit harder to do as an analogy. But if you took all the human beings out of the universe would definitely still be here. I don't even think that's contested. But what formulas? What happened?
We wouldn't know.
There's nothing in physics that suggests it wouldn't be here if we suddenly disappeared.
Right.
There's galaxies that exist way beyond our even grasp.
But the thing is, if we didn't exist, we wouldn't know.
But you wouldn't know, but the universe would, because the universe isn't dependent on you. All of us could be wiped out today by like a supernova, and the universe would still be there.
Right, it isn't dependent on human knowledge, but I think there is an interrelation there that is dependent on the other side of the equation. So like, yeah, the universe would still exist if humans weren't around, but would galaxies at all exist without the space between them? Would planets exist without stars there? Would hydrogen exist without helium? Would a proton exist without a neutron? This is the duality that I think...
None of those things would change if we simply just disappeared. So
humans? No, of course not. It's too anthropocentric.
So that is not... I mean, that's where the universe is objective to me. Like, there are objective things about the universe. Science, mathematics, whatever, attempts to tease those things out and try to distill them into their most objective form. Obviously, it's not going to get to 100% because there is a matter of precision, but it's the best we have. We have a subjective experience of that. However, the objective universe isn't dependent upon our subjective experience of it. We can come and go as we do with life and death. Universe is still going to be there. Physics is still going to be there. All of these things are still going to be interacting fundamentally.
How do you know
that?
Yeah, that's the problem. You can't know
way.
that. It's the same thing. Like you're saying, it's going to be there whether we're not. And so I'm saying exactly the same thing, which can't be proved either way.
Right.
So we're pretty much at a standstill. We'd have to agree that from my side, I can't say I absolutely know this is true, and from your side, you would have to say, yeah, that may be true, but I don't absolutely know that is true either.
Correct. I wouldn't make an absolute claim, but that's the sort of a disclaimer of our whole existence. You'll never have any absolution about things.
Sure.
Which is the subject of today's talk.
It seems somewhat pointless to argue it though, because you'll never absolutely know, and that's the whole point somewhat.
Right.
Yes. Yeah,
but it's fun to try to understand the nature of the question.
I think it's fun to try to see what the limit of our understanding can be. And that's somewhat where like science has to be married into like philosophy, at least at this juncture of human history, because the pinnacle questions are being asked at the frontier of science, like quantum physics. Given that quantum physics exists, the whole debate changes. Before we knew about quantum physics, or if we had Newtonian physics, right, the philosophy was a lot more simpler. But as time goes on and we learn more about the mysteries of the universe, like the philosophical framings tend to break down by way of what we know more of than we didn't before. So if we know like maybe 10% and then we learn 20%, everything changes by nature of knowing more. So we won't know 100%, but if we start to get to 99.99% and a person's like, hey, the universe isn't this way because 0.0 I mean, 0.001% chance that it isn't.
How do you
It
know
becomes
how
kind of
much,
weird to
how
argue
do you
that.
know
Yeah.
what percentage of knowledge is left unknown?
There's scales, right? That's a easier
Well,
thing to talk about. Like,
it could be infinite. It could be unlimited amount of knowledge, and therefore you would never reach anywhere close to the end.
Yeah, you could think that you're at 90% and you only have 10% of knowledge left to go in the entire universe, but really you have 90% left, and you wouldn't know that because you can't see how big the 100% really is.
it actually starts to break down once you are able to do cause and effect deterministic projections. So once you get down to that scale, or you get up to that scale, and you literally can say beyond a shadow of a doubt what the outcome of something's going to be, which trends towards determinism, you're getting pretty close to that 100% in my mind. I'm not saying we're there yet with quantum physics, but we're not pretty close, but we're things are going to get magical past that level, I would say.
They used to think that before they discovered quantum physics. They thought that Newtonian physics probably explained about 90% of existence, and that maybe there was a little bit left to add to it, but nothing really big. No big surprises on the horizon. We've got it mostly figured out at this point.
Here's where I don't feel you can make an analogy to the past, because literally at the quantum scale or the Planck scale, we don't even have the means to interact with that. The mere act of us trying to measure at that scale perturbs it. So you would have to say that we're going to be able to engineer some instrument to work at that scale.
Well, that's
and
what
that's kind of
lasers do.
questionable.
I mean, lasers are...
No.
Yeah.
Electrons and photons, you're literally getting down to like double slit experiment. So you're literally not...
computers exist as well, that exist in a state of neither 1 nor 0 until you process them. I mean, we're definitely making technology based on quantum physics.
Very loosely. Very, very loosely.
We don't know how much is left to discover. How could you possibly? You'd have to know everything in order to know what was left.
Because the very act of measuring it changes it. So with quantum computers, literally, they're interacting with it. You literally can't measure at that scale without changing the state, which is how quantum computers work. They take a measurement, and that measurement perturbs the whole quantum realm.
Yeah.
There aren't cases of doing that where it has as much of an effect. So the issue would be simply we would have to be able to shrink down our tools and our experiments and our measures to that scale, and that's very, very questionable.
So you're saying there's a limit to technology?
Working in tech, how small you can make a transistor gate, we're definitely hitting limits.
Well, again, it's only seems to be a wall because we haven't reached it. We haven't had enough time. If this is look back in history, like going down into material, we've seen that we thought the atom was the smallest thing, and then we went further and we went further and we went further. Same thing with looking up. We looked into the sky, into the universe. We see there's planets, there's stars, there's galaxies, there's going further and further up, and it just keeps expanding, keeps expanding, it keeps expanding. It's expanding in both directions, and it's very likely that it just goes on forever.
We know limits. Like, for instance, there's it's not the limit, the speed of light. It's literally the speed of causality in the universe is what is referred to as the speed of light. So literally, our understanding is you can never exceed that. So that's a limit. Black holes are like a macro event that we literally could never get into without not being able to escape. That's a limit, or so we feel right now. And quantum physics is a limit.
For now, that's all. Yeah, that's my
the thing
point.
is,
no, it's a limit that light itself can't escape. So that's a limit. You got two limits here: speed of light and light.
Quantum entanglement works faster than the speed of light.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's another thing faster. Well, not thing, but there's something faster than light in that space. It's a lot faster than.
Is it?
Yeah,
because
it
we
is.
can't
Yes.
measure anything. We can't
it
measure
is.
anything faster than the speed of light.
Well,
That's
Well,
what
it
I'm
is
then
saying.
because
Speed
we
of
wouldn't be
causality.
able to, because
Then
there
it's a
wouldn't be a
limitation.
border of there wouldn't be a border of the universe then, because
There's a
then if
limitation
light is the
of
fastest,
technology.
Yeah.
then we would be able to see
Okay, if
outside
you
our own universe.
so this is what I mean to say. In the past, we were nowhere near this. I hope you understand, which is why it's not an analogy. The very nature of the universe, right? You could say there's something underneath that, but you have to understand we're physical, right? So we can't interact with things beyond the speed of light because that's the speed of causality. So if you want to interact with some quantum, say you want to figure out what quantum entanglement. So I take something, entangle it, move it from one point to another. The irony is you cannot measure that beyond like faster than the speed of light. So this is where it's funny because the way that it's marketed, they have to do a causality measurement when they entangle things and they move them apart. So they're not doing anything at the quantum scale when it comes to like entanglement. They're literally using photons often to do the measurement. So that's the limit. So if we find something below that, I think it would be great. But physically we can't move that fast. You would have to literally convert yourself into light and re-render it on like the other side. So the sci-fi stuff where they literally teleport you and stuff like that, we'd have to break into that, which is, in my mind, it's still not going to contradict any of the stuff we've established because our science is now focused on scales. So we figured out things on a certain scale, but we haven't figured it out on another scale. So we're literally just probing scales for different understanding. And the scales, when you find something on the smaller scale, it tends not to contradict the stuff on the higher scale. It just maybe allows you to be more precise.
Sure.
But like throwing a baseball at somebody is still going to be affected by gravity, no matter what we
Yeah,
discover
but
in quantum
there
physics.
can be contradictions from going large to small. Like for example, the properties of water, they don't act this. It's not the same without clusters of H2O molecules. If you had only one molecule of H2O, you wouldn't have that same liquid effect or that state of liquid. If you have multiple
like
or on a macro scale, then you would have that effect. That what is it called? I'll figure it out. Give me a second.
and I wasn't intending for this to be like a science teaser. I was just more or less pointing out. I feel like when you're discussing the topics philosophically, in my mind, these kind of details would come into play in order to have a more modern conversation. Because these are the things that, for instance, you said contradicts or paradox. This is what science is finding. So if someone makes a philosophical assertion, essentially there's oftentimes a lot of science that would. So I just try to include the two. So sorry for this exercise if it
No,
somewhat seemed like that.
You don't need to be sorry. Everybody's
Okay.
Free to bring in their own understanding. That's exactly what this is about. So you don't have to feel that you did anything wrong. I think if anything, we appreciate that you're bringing your knowledge, which you seem very knowledgeable, to the table. I love that.
All you do. So I just want to say that as well. You all have a you all are informed on this topic, which is refreshing. So Guy, I think
So
you're saying something. Sorry.
I wanted to ask before, related to back to the virtueless knowledge thing. I'm sorry if that's an annoying topic.
No, that's fine.
But
no, that's what I was meaning to say. I didn't want to get too off because I remembered you were discussing.
If the question required you to have knowledge of the future, that was my question.
I don't think so. Like virtue to me is like if I were to try to make a language for it, a universal language, I would use physics. So I would literally use like force, constructive force versus deconstructive force. So what is virtuous? It's If someone is utilizing constructive force or energy in order to achieve something, unless the end goal is like negative for themselves, others, society, like you don't really have a virtuous case in terms of interacting destructively with them. So like not hitting someone without a reason and yada yada yada. So I think just the basis of like the universe somewhat reflects that. And if you even look at nature, if you went walking around just slapping various animals, you'd probably get like a pretty nasty reaction. And it kind of highlights how certain things are somewhat intrinsic in terms of like virtue. Where humans were way more complicated, but we essentially have built up on top of the same foundation that's inherent in the universe. So I don't think you need to predict the future in order to see that.
Okay.
If you're doing something aimed at the future, of course, because you want to make sure it's aligned
That's
to some
related
future
to
goal.
That's related to subjectivity. I'm asking if there's an objective. If there was an objective knowledge, would the question require you to know of the future?
Objective. True.
Yeah. You mean absolute objective? Yeah, you would have to know the future because it would be something that transcends time.
Mm-hmm.
That idea.
I would agree with that.
So, if that's true, then if we apply Buddhist ideas, in which where the only thing that there is the now, the future doesn't exist, and the past doesn't exist, and if that question is asking if the only way to know that objective truth is with knowledge of the future, then would that debunk that there is no objective truth?
Well, no, I think the Buddhist principle is to be still and take in and observe the change around you. And only then, when you remove your subjective sort of framing, can you see the more objective reality. The more objective.
Right. But
yeah,
but like I said, if we can agree that you have to know the future in order to answer that question, and that we agree that there is no future, we can say that the present moment is going in a certain direction, but we can't say we can go to the future. Then
you do it all the time, like planning. Planning is the idea
that's
that
not. No, but that's in the present moment.
But planning is the idea that, but it's the idea that you sit still, make a lot of observations so that your prediction can be good. So in Buddhism, the meditation, right, is to be still, see the past, see the present, and see the future by allowing the flow, the arrow of time, to be able to perceive that. So time does flow in one direction, or it's argued,
it flows
but it's
like I said, yes, I agree with you. It does flow in a direction, but we can't go to the future. We're currently going there.
You can
we're never getting
predict
there.
It. More accurately predict it. If I planted a seed in my backyard and I saw and I sat still and just stared at it and just watched this tree like sprout up from the ground, and I knew what seed I planted and yada yada yada, and I made sure the soil is good, I can pretty much predict that tree is going to grow and be like this healthy big tree like years and years from now, right? So certain things, right, like are of that nature, and we're even using a lot of technology to get better at that.
But could you plant a seed of a tree and draw what the tree would look like before the tree grew, and that would be accurate?
Yeah, for certain types of trees, yeah. Like pretty accurate picture. It's not going to be 100%.
When I say accurate, I mean this branch is going in this direction, that branch is going that direction.
Theoretically, if you knew every single possible atom that was going into it, like calculus level math, you could. It's just that that level of processing would require so much knowledge and power. You don't even need to know the future. I mean, you could take the
So
question,
we could only ask practically.
you could ask the question.
It's always practical.
freeze.
Why would you want to know the future so bad? That's what I mean. That's where you're involved in this loop here. So
No,
if you
I'm
wanted to
not.
be able
There's
to
no
be
loop.
still and predict the
It's
future,
related to the question. It's related to the question that if we have to know the future in order to answer the question, that there's a virtuous knowledge, and that we agree that there is no future time, we can only say that the present moment is going in a certain direction, but it's never ending, or we're never getting to the future. We're always going to the future. Then is it fair to say that that the question is invalid?
why would that question? I'm curious. What prompted you to inquire about this?
Because that was the discussion today.
Now, okay, hang on. It's not just about the future, because you can't even know everything about the present moment now. I mean, we have limited knowledge in terms of what we can know with what's going on right now. And if you froze the present moment and tried to understand where every single molecule was, you would have to have the knowledge of God in order to completely predict the future in a way. So you can't even know what's going on right now.
But I'm not trying to predict the future here. I'm
Who
trying
is?
to know objective
Who
truth.
is and why? Why do you want to know the objective truth if it requires you to know the future?
It's the conclusion that we came to was that unless you were God, you can't.
But then that would be subjective, like Gareth said.
Would be subjective?
Yeah,
No.
because it would be subjective to that God.
Yeah.
To that God, that's what the goal of the universe is.
No. That would just be an objective. That would just you being at a higher dimension than time and space, being able to perceive
it wouldn't be me. It would be the God.
God, or whatever you want to call that perspective, right? But it literally would just be a perspective that's like fifth dimension. It would be outside of time and space.
In order to
And you
have
would
a
see it as one.
perspective, you'd have to have something you're looking at. So you'd have to have something that was separate from God for God to be able to look at something and have a perspective on it. And theoretically, God wouldn't be separate from anything, so there is no perspective on anything anymore. The only way God can look at itself is if it separates itself.
Yeah.
So
Big bang, boom.
Bada bing,
Separation.
bada boom.
So then
these questions
so then-
that human beings
So
ponder.
great, right?
then the question would be, is God being? And could, if it does exist, answer that question.
God's a being. God exists outside of time and space. God has a perspective of this whole shebang, right? From a godly perspective, which is apart from and separate from this existence. I'll give you a perfect example. If I wanted to write a really cool video game in which the things inside the video game were AIs and they didn't know, I would write the code, I'd run it on a computer. That computer would be separate from me. I would be able to know if I coded it correctly what the outcomes would be, and I would just watch this game go by.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Where's
don't
the
imagine
border?
God is of that type of. What's this?
Where's the border between you and the computer?
It's literally like sitting underneath my desk. It's completely separate from me.
Yeah, I think...
Right. But where's the border? Where's the actual line? Where
Space.
is the barrier
So here,
between...
time and space, like 4D, right? Just draw a big cube.
I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean.
So
I know what space is.
I'm here, it's there. Yeah.
Or rather, I understand what space is. I don't know what it is.
I'll throw time in there too. It's dimensional if there's a beginning and end, at least.
Okay. Now, if you can see that there's a space, how are you so sure that that qualifies as a barrier between you and the computer?
Because it's just causal, right? So does anything on the computer cause anything interact with me? No. If I put it in a room, like in a separate room, yada yada yada, I wasn't looking at the monitor. It would just be churning along, running, right? When I looked at it, right, there could be some interaction, mechanism, as we all know, with like photons, right? But I can make magical photons that literally flow in one direction, don't have any causal impact, this kind of thing. You can get really creative.
What do you mean by impact?
So there wouldn't be any.
So because it doesn't interact with you sometimes, that means that there is a barrier?
I can make it one way where I can perceive it, it can't perceive me. In that, hey, maybe I like watching my simulation like have fun. But nothing I'm gonna be able to do to it can impact it. So by me observing it, yeah, it's simple, like photons, right? Like, so me observing it isn't gonna change the state of whatever the hell was going on. So if a photon like pops off of this table and I see the table, I'm not interacting necessarily with the table.
So because the computer isn't sentient, that means it can't interact with you?
Because there's no physical like link here. So if you start drawing dimensions, I'm not really good on this aspect of it, but if I draw out dimensions X, Y, Z, and T, like, so 4 dimensions, that's what this whole universe is contained in, set, and that's a set. So, and I exist in a separate set, and there is no causal link. You can just prove this with like set theory. Then we're not causally entangled. So I can observe it. I can make it a law that it can't observe me, and that's just the way things are, because I'm the one who created it, so I make the rules.
But then it wouldn't exist without you, right? Isn't that a causal link?
So the beginning and the end, I guess you can say. Or the beginning.
The beginning is causally linked with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's kind of what Guy is asking, is like, can a computer exist in a vacuum?
I don't know what that gets you, though. All right, I guess this
is just to answer the question
whether or not there's an actual barrier between you and things.
The thing you're always going to come down to with this, and this is what I mean, like, if you try to argue any absolute, it's just going to be somewhat folly if the goal wasn't to just perceive where the granularity is. Because it's always going to be qualitative. Like, what kind of...
That's not fair. That's not fair to say.
It's what we're discovering so far, even with quantum physics, right? So the idea here is just like, I could put up a wall. I could just put up a series of trees as a border. Then I can make a fence, and then I can make like a concrete wall. It's just the separation mechanism, right? It's just, the argument is always going to be about what's the quality of that separation, right? Whether something, even if I did all of this, I can literally have a case where there's quantum phenomenon entangled across that wall. So you see where you're just going to keep getting better and better at like what this barrier is. But to argue absolutely, is there some type of causal entanglement between us and God? Maybe we'll find out. The science is still out.
Yeah, science is still out. I think that's kind of the conclusion, is like, when we talk about knowledge, there's always room for doubt. There's always some kind of percentage of possibility that the things we think we know are not what we actually know. And this is why the question was about, is there such thing as objective truth? Because objective truth would be 100% knowledge, and it seems like we are, as limited beings, we don't have access to 100% knowledge of anything. Everything is up for doubt. And I think that's why Guy was trying to kind of like nail down whether or not this exists, because it does seem like in our limited perspectives and understandings, it doesn't exist and probably can't exist.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, absolutism and determinism I think when they came about, and this is what I mean to say, and this is why I try not to use older things when we have newer things, because these older words and terms had different connotations, had different purposes, agendas, discussions, because literally the science wasn't as refined. So at a time, right, it was questionable whether we would get to some ultimate limit. Like, it seemed like it was right within our grasp. When you discover something like quantum physics, it's like, well, hell, like if even the thing that's below the thing, 10 to the negative whatever, is just buzzing around and isn't even concrete. Holy shit. It changes the whole when you say objective, it almost seems as though it's a goalpost out there somewhere. Like, so we assume that we can get to 100%. So we put this goalpost way out there into the future, and then we work towards it. So when you use that term, I don't think it's a debatable term unless you're furnishing the debate with the most updated science that really is getting at whether or not the universe is deterministic or free will. So like, and I've been hearing these conversations a lot, and I'm feeling like the best way to argue about that, I would hope, because, you know, we're not God sitting at like a round table discussing the fate of the universe with all knowledge.
Or are we?
So if there's new tooling or new understanding, I basically see in my mind arguing, the reason why you would argue or debate is to learn something new, hopefully. So you say, someone says the universe is deterministic, someone says it's free will. I expect in modern times that the debate is going to be about like some scientific framing. I think philosophers did a lot of the groundwork and the foundational work, and even still, there's much work for them to do now that the new science is out. But if it isn't coupled with like something like quantum physics, you say objective, and if the discussion isn't about like the nature of quantum physics itself, then it's like, okay, when a person says determinism, you see how you're using the wrong tools in the debate in modern times? So objective universe, I just think that's a goalpost. I think it's okay to talk about it, but you have to always remember it's a goalpost. Like, we're not going to be able to hash out for some time whether or not it's objective, because we're maybe at 20%.
You said that
So
when we talk about things, we should have the goal of trying to learn something new, and that's why we should debate these ideas. And I think we can only have that goal if we question what we think we already know. And if we close ourselves off thinking that I already know this, so there's nothing new I can learn, then you can't have an open and honest debate where you might learn something new, because you come at it with already a presupposition that you already know. And this is why virtue epistemology, and I'm going to keep saying it, is so important, because virtue intellectualism is what allows us to realize I don't actually know everything and I could be wrong. And it's so important to be open about that possibility.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
And plus, not only that, even if we don't come to a conclusion that if we come to the conclusion that we can't know what objective truth is, does that mean that we should close off our doors? Well, that's that, I guess.
No.
Well, what I mean to say is, like, for me, I know that I don't know, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I go to sleep every day, like, knowing that I'll likely never know. Like, I'm going to live and die, and I'm not going to really know the answers to these questions. That motivates me. But I look at things as goalposts. I would say some people don't know that they don't know. And those people would be best helped if they're basically saying, oh, no, the universe is objective. And then you walk them through it and you help them understand why that's wrongheaded. Mm-hmm. Those debates always need to occur, because some people don't know that they don't know.
Now, here's the thing. If you can say that with gusto, that is the truth, then that's objective truth, isn't it?
That it's
is
the
that
truth
objective
that
truth?
they should be aware that they don't know?
The idea
Right.
that there's always outliers to any statement?
Ooh, here's a really good question.
Subjective truth is its own objective truth.
If there is no objective truth, and I say that, is that objective truth?
Can you repeat before
It's
what
kind
you
of like
just
saying
said? Subjective
the only
truth is its
permanence
own.
is impermanence.
Yeah,
Ooh,
which
okay.
is what I said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that there is objective truth. There is something that there is there, but it's not.
There's another way of saying this.
I know that I don't know.
The ultimate paradox is that there is no paradox.
Yeah.
I
It's
understand
just
that with this one.
it's just a funny way of saying it.
The only thing I know is that I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I started thinking that, so because of that, that means that there is some sort of objective truth that we are all operating under, that we have a hard time seeing, maybe.
Well, no, it's just continues to go in a big loop. And it just loops and loops and loops, and it can never be answered. Like,
Yeah.
that's it.
How can you say that?
Because every time you take a stance, there's an opposite. Every single time.
You can, yeah, when it comes to subjectivity, but if we're talking about something that's objective, and we can't answer that question, but we can say that the answer is that there is no answer because you can't answer it.
Well, then
is
there's
that not
an
objective truth?
There's your answer.
Isn't that an answer? And
Yeah.
therefore, again, that's what I'm saying. It's what they talk about as a paradox. It just goes in a loop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is it a loop, or does it invalidate subjectivity and objectivity?
Unless you can basically like squish the universe into a singular point that literally has no delta, like there's always going to be a subjective perspective that varies from another. So
it's kind of like saying, does this question that doesn't have an answer, like you're asking a question and we're saying the answer is no answer, and you're asking, well, is no answer a type of answer? And not really, because a better answer would just be an absence or silence. It's not really like no answer is the answer and therefore there's an answer.
Silent. If you stay silent, that doesn't mean that there isn't an answer. That doesn't mean that there is an answer. It just means that there's silence.
Buddhists were right after all. I'm just kidding.
Seriously, they are.
We win. Okay.
Artificial intelligence, but I strangely have found myself coming back to quantum physics over the years. So here I am attempting to formulate a new simulation for physical phenomenon in order to utilize it for AI. If you can predict, it's funny enough for the conversation, if you have an accurate internal world model that allows you to do a lot more intelligent actions. So essentially some of the underpinnings of physics relate to like modern day AI, or at least frontier AI. So that's where I find my interest in this topic.
It's funny, I was talking about AI last night and self-awareness, and if you programmed an AI to believe it was self-aware, would that count as self-awareness?
I'm going to leave that up to, I don't think that's impossible. I think we're actually going to see that in our lifetime, but I'm going to leave that debate up to specialists.
Well, I could program code right now to do that. I could program a code to believe that it's self-aware, and if I ask, are you self-aware, it will respond yes, but that wouldn't be self-awareness as we know it. It wouldn't be intuitively self-aware just because I made it respond in that way.
Yeah, it comes down to the fidelity of what that is and how much it scares the shit out of people as to when it will be a debate. And even if I end up on the team of people who engineers that, that's not a debate I'm going to spend much time on. I'll let other people hash that up. That's a pretty contentious debate.
Yeah, another thing I was going to bring up during this talk was, let's say that we were in a simulation and you could program the people in your simulation to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. And that's reality for them. That is an objective truth in their universe, is 2 + 2 = 5, because that's how you programmed it. But in your world, the actual truth is that 2 + 2 = 4. And so even if you programmed your entire universe that you made to believe 2 + 2 = 5, it's still not an absolute truth, just because you programmed the universe you made that way.
Yeah, if you were to do that or put an Easter egg in the universe, essentially if your agents became intelligent enough, that would be I wouldn't want to play that game because things could get very that would be a way of tracing back to you. If they found like a paradox of that order in the universe, it would be like, oh, somebody wants to play funny games, huh?
Isn't that kind of like quantum physics? I mean, it's almost proof for simulation theory is that this is the reason that quantum physics acts so weird is because the program is breaking down and the code isn't working at that level.
Or that's where the code is working and you weren't meant to see beyond that level. Yeah, you could argue various different things.
You weren't meant to see behind the curtain.
So it made a really good wall, like I said.
Not good enough.
Speed of light wasn't good enough? All right, I'm going to make a double wall, quantum physics.
Speed of light, I'm surprised you didn't mention the Planck constant. That's a pretty good one.
Yeah, like Planck unit of length and time. Well, I mean, if you're really, I don't know if you, I just came across this myself, but somebody broke down how it's not the speed of light, it's literally the speed of causality. And they walked through what exactly that means. I thought that was a way, essentially that's what it was always originally meant to be. It just so happens that light as a phenomenon and other things map to that. So literally that constant is found everywhere. So they called it the speed of causality because everything basically is limited by that, not just light. There's some other phenomenon I think that's limited by that constant as well. I thought that was pretty mind-bending.
What perspective would you have to have in order to be objective? And I think that the answer is there is no perspective, because if you had a perspective, it would be coming from that perspective. It wouldn't be relating it to everything else.
Well, I mean, I guess you're talking about like the decoupling thing again. Yeah, I mean, if you were to have that perspective, you would necessarily have to be outside the bounds of that whatever you're looking at. So like X, Y, Z, T, you have to be outside of space and time, and that would have its own downsides, I guess.
Right, but then that means that there would be something outside of you. Meaning that
so for me to be able to perceive you, I have to be outside of you.
That you're missing.
No, not in that realm. If you're completely outside of a realm X, Y, Z, T, and you're looking at it from a higher order dimension, you see everything.
Well, then where are you?
Outside of it.
You would be in a
outside of. You would be outside of. Yes, you would be outside of this dimension.
In the same way that in the third dimension you can look at the second dimension.
Exactly. All right, but just if you're interested, and thank God it was this channel because it's pretty good. It's only like 13 minutes, but he gets into the speed of causality. So the title is "The Speed of Light is Not About Light."
I do have to go get some dinner, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. You guys can keep talking if you want, but I'm gonna finish off the Sunday discussion because I gotta go get some.
I can tell you exactly how the universe works. No, just kidding.
Let me turn off the recording right there.
I'm kidding.
I did look this up, and I think this is pretty interesting because I've heard of this before, the light cone of the event and the causal chain, and this goes into epistemology. Epistemology has a causal chain of knowledge where you can say you know a fact because you have an unbroken causal chain from when that fact happened to when you learned about it.
Yeah, so that's what I meant to say is like very much so like the upper reaches of like physics are very much related to philosophy. That's kind of why I find myself here. Yeah, it's very much related. So I think you'll see even a lot of the terminology like causal chains and stuff like that, cause and effect, etc.
Was the third eye information comes around about finding the inside of everything throughout this type of universe in this perspective?
Yes, we did figure out everything.
I thought so.
Yes, Scott, you should have seen it, man.
Yeah,
it was
you missed
cool.
it.
There was fireworks.
Yeah. Good thing I recorded it. Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to take off. Thanks for joining us for the Sunday discussion, guys. Mao, it was great to have you for a first time. You definitely should join us again in the future. I promise we do talk about more concrete subjects. This one was very, very nebulous, but I felt like it was kind of necessary because it's sort of a foundational philosophy. So
that was fun.
Yeah. You can listen to the beginning if you want. I'll post this video. I'll have to edit. I still have to post last Sunday's talk and edit that one, but I'll do that. We already have one up on YouTube about Nietzsche, but yeah, I'll get all that stuff done and we'll post it and we'll pick our next Sunday discussion. And yeah, anybody with any suggestions, just DM me or post it in Sunday. And yeah, thanks for coming, guys.
Welcome.
See ya.
See ya.
See.